Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. I'm your host, I'm Oscar Clark, and I'm basically here on a podquest to learn everything there is to know about game dev that you never dared to ask. And today I am delighted to be joined by the amazing Crystin from Xbox Game Studio, who's also the host of a fantastic podcast that I love listening to as well, the Art of LiveOps. And if you have any interest in running games sustainably and keeping them live, you should be listening to this podcast. Now, enough plugging. Crystin, tell us all about yourself and your, who you are and what you do.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, Oscar. It's super great to be on. I'm excited I'm going to be a guest today instead of hosting. But yeah, I'm at Xbox Game Studios Publishing. I'm the director of business strategy for that group right now. Before I joined Xbox, I spent 16 years as a game dev making live ops games, pretty much exclusively large scale MMOs. The sort of highlights there, Guild Wars 2 and MapleStory. So spent 16 years doing that, sometimes as a game designer, sometimes as a game director, sometimes as a producer, doing all the things that you do to make a game run smoothly. Done a lot of work in game economies and monetization specifically, which is sort of how I ended up in this business world that I'm in now, but still very much just an advocate for live ops games and live ops design, and just sort of anyone that's trying to make a game that they are running for a long time and build a community around that game.
And obviously, this podcast is all about a community of game developers who are making kind of games, whether or not they're in London. And I mean, I think it's really kind of like important when you kind of see these different groups talking to each other about these different topics. And I'm gonna own up. MapleStory was a massive influence in a lot of the design decisions that I made around, how to approach things we were doing on PlayStation Home even. It's amazing how much I think it's hugely influential, MapleStory.
I absolutely adored working on MapleStory. I came on to work on it after it had already been live. So it was one of the first times I stepped in to work on something that already had been somewhat established. And I was working on what we called the global version of MapleStory. So MapleStory is actually localized really specifically in a way that I think isn't done as much anymore, but was more common in the very early 2000s, where every region had their own different version of the game with actually unique content, and it was uniquely ran by a different team. And so we were doing the version that was sort of rest of world. So anyone that didn't have their own version, which was sort of, there was the original South Korean version of it, there was a Chinese version of it, there was a Japanese version of it, so on and so forth. So most of our players were in the West, though.
It's interesting because I think it was the South Korean version we saw, but we had to have people translate it to understand what was going on. But I mean, I've been fascinated by the South Korean gaming scene. I mean, since so in '98 when I was running Wireplay, we made a bid to try and run StarCraft servers in Europe. We didn't get it, but that's life. But it was fascinating looking at what's happening in the Korean scene. So '98, they still had televised StarCraft.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amazing. Working in Korea so closely with Korea, because half of my team was in Korea at the time and half of the team was in Los Angeles, where we had an office. But it was really wonderful to get exposed to all of this experience, because even like in the early 2000s, there was already quite a bit of experience in live ops games, free-to-play games out of Korea, and working for Nexon was just incredible. Like I feel like I got an incredible education working there. I got exposure to, dozens and dozens of live and free-to-play games that we operated all over the world, and working on MapleStory, which was a huge game with just a massive amount of people playing it, and such a innovator, as you said, in sort of this world of virtual worlds. Like I think we would have more categorized it as a virtual world and had a lot of systems and mechanics and gameplay in it, but we would have more categorized it as a virtual world. And the target audience being younger people, I think really helped sharpen some of my live ops skills. I think younger people, no one gives you feedback like a teenager. It's pretty, comes in raw and honest. And I think that really helped, hone those skills of listening to feedback, iterating on that feedback, delivering, and also recovering from errors, which is something that when I talk to teams that have been making games for a long time, but maybe haven't been doing live ops games for a long time, I tend to run into a lot of perfectionism, which is sort of a noble goal, but in live ops, you can't avoid it. You're going to make some mistakes, and so getting those reps in of going, ooh, yeah, put that out there. Didn't have great response, didn't do great numbers, didn't get great community feedback, and then being able to learn to get past that. And also to sometimes just apologize to your player base and say, oh, yep, we messed that up.
No, exactly. And like I say, it wasn't just the PlayStation and virtual world that I was talking about that influenced us there. I actually was thinking about it when I was looking at the design for things like how we were going to charge for games back in the Java day. I mean, a bit later on, obviously, but it is interesting how, learning how cosmetics worked and the in-app purchase process. And we were doing some of the earliest in-app purchase stuff on mobile devices back in like 2003. But that wouldn't have happened without seeing the websites doing interesting things with that and realizing, hey, a browser or a app on a phone is just a connection to a network.
Yeah, absolutely. We had really some of the best integration even that I've seen even since when I was at Nexon between our games and our online presence. We'd like a lot of really deep connection. We had one touch game launching off of the website, many, many years ago, and stuff that we talk about now with even better technology is getting better and better. Like, the ability to sort of just like deep link into a game experience because of cloud streaming. But even back then, we had a really integrated system with a great like content management system. I think we complained about it a lot when we were working on it. Now I look back on it very fondly. Like, everything was all together.
That just tapped into some deep inner self there when you said complaining about the CMS system. I mean that is literally like a daily occurrence, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I think this has become a bit of a joke that whatever project you're working on now has the worst tools ever until you move to the next project, and then the previous one had the best tools ever.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah, you can't help it. Like when you're living in it every day, you find everything wrong. But honestly, like, those tools really were well integrated, and I think we did a lot of really interesting things that have shaped a lot of the way I think about how important it is to sort of eliminate friction between both like your services and your actual gameplay, and to eliminate friction for your players, and just really focus in on how can we make this easy and meet players where they are. And you sort of talked about monetization. MapleStory was early enough that a huge part of that monetization was physical cards, and sort of pay for like pay by cash for like codes at like convenience stores and things like that. And I think about that a lot now because it was definitely challenging, but I think at the time there was no choice. We had to meet. There wasn't a lot of apparatus to just take secure payments online, so we just did what we needed to do.
Teenagers don't have credit cards.
Generally, no, and they didn't have cell phones at the time either, right? So now a lot of teenagers do have cell phones that might be connected to like their parents' wallet, and they may have an allowance or something inside of it, but at the time, that was not true. They did not have cell phones either, for the most part. So we were really trying to meet them where they were.
No, exactly. And I think that's what's fascinating about it, is that it's amazing how we can draw these threads, this kind of patterns of information as we've evolved, and we've got more. And I think you put it really nicely. It's this reduction in friction. I think in every space where we've had innovation for games, it's been about either data or reduction in friction.
Absolutely.
And to me, that's why I think LiveOps is so interesting and fascinating, because I think that is what the heart and pulse of LiveOps is that combination between making the player's experience easier over the long term, but also data. But so you've been there, you've done it, and now you spend a lot of time talking to other people who've been there and done it and asking them about that experience. So I'm going to ask you kind of about so I'm interested to know, what are the things that really stand out to you, the kind of commonalities that you think that game developers who may or may not think about LiveOps as an important thing, what are the commonalities you think that people should take away, that they should pay attention to with LiveOps?
So one of the reasons we wanted to start doing the podcast was we were spending, and I still spend quite a bit of my time at work talking to teams that were trying to do it. And a lot of times trying to do it for the first time. And one of the things we noticed was how intimidating it was. Like we'd sit down, we'd talk to developers, and we would say, here's all the things that is LiveOps. It's data and iteration, your content architecture, your feedback loop, and we would have this long list of things. And I think we've gotten better about presenting it in a less intimidating way. But even when we sort of are softening that message, it feels like a lot. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast was to highlight what I think is the real big commonality that I see, which is that it's always a journey for every single person that's doing it. Nobody is like, yes, I got it all figured out before I ever shipped my game. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I just executed, and it was completely 100% smooth sailing. It's always a journey. There's always learning. You're always using the data and iterating to make it better. And no matter how sophisticated you get at doing LiveOps, you're never going to get so much experience you don't need to do the actions that make up LiveOps, which is largely listening to community, gathering data, combining those two pieces of feedback, and iterating.
Yeah, no, I think that this is a really common thing for me as well, which is this sense of intimidation that a lot of devs have over it. Now, I don't want to say it's not a lot of work, because obviously there is a lot of work involved, but I think a lot of the issues are about preparation and setting up systems that allow you to do things simply on a schedule basis. Because I think if you're trying to manage a game and every day you've got to go in and configure something, you're going to break something.
Yes.
But if you can say, right, this is the 30-day schedule, these are the things that are going to happen over the 30-day schedule, this is the content that has to be there, here's the fallover if that content isn't there for some reason, then you've got some way of managing that experience sensibly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and absolutely. This is probably the biggest paradigm shift, I think, for developers who are coming from a lot of experience making games that are not LiveOps and then moving to a LiveOps system, or even new developers who are starting out in LiveOps, I think have to sort of make this mental switch that when you're building the game, you're actually should be focused on preparing to run the game. And that's really what you're setting up, is your ability to run the game. So as you said, prioritizing not just how do I make these changes, but how do I automate? How do I create pipelines so that I don't mess things up when I make those changes? How do I prepare to run the game? And it can be really challenging because so much of game dev that's for sort of linear consumed games is really just about making content. You sort of like rush to get an engine stood up and a content pipeline stood up just good enough so that you can make this set of content and then just sort of polish it up and package it and put it out. And there's this big paradigm shift where you're like, actually, most of your work for getting a LiveOps game ready to go is just preparing to run it. And asking yourself, how are you going to improve it over time? And that can be tough, especially for AAA teams who are making the transition, who the expectation is they're still going to deliver this huge drop of very polished content
that can't be changed, except it always is.
Yes. Probably the biggest thing I think I tell teams now, like, or one of the most repeated things I say is build everything as if you are absolutely going to change it 3 times at least. And that's really tough for teams that have worked traditionally in waterfall methodology, waterfall production methodology, because they'll like show us, schedules that are like, and this is where we'll be content locked, and I'll have to come in and say, there's no such thing as content locked. Literally everything could change.
No, exactly.
After you ship the game.
Oh, we've had this recently. I can't say the name of the particular company for various reasons, but it's really fascinating seeing somebody coming in with very old school waterfall style milestones, and then we're trying to map LiveOps KPI led structures against that. And so I don't care if it's feature complete at this particular point. I care that the CPI is going to be this. I don't care that later on that we've got this. What I care about is that the day 7 retention is this. And I don't care if this feature's there. I care that it's played.
Right.
And that is the massive paradigm shift, isn't it?
It's huge. I'll step in because I think that waterfall, people get a little bit beat up for it. And I will say that it is completely understandable to do it that way for a big, like, single player linear game.
For a project,
I completely understand why you would do it, because there's a ton of interdependencies in game development. It's a lot of people, I think, in game dev have actually had the experience of having agile consultants come in and tell you, like, oh, all you need to do is make sure your team doesn't get bigger than 10 people and that they can do everything completely independently with no interdependencies. And it's like, no problem. But games just can't be built that way.
No.
So I think it is a real challenge. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the podcast was to sort of start showing people, other people have been through this across the spectrum. People who came natively from mobile, people who came natively from free to play, people who came from AAA, people who came from, big MMOs, people who came from little casual games, all of these things, and people who came from really huge casual games. All of these things are experiences people have had, and you're not alone.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I'd argue that my earliest experience was working with massive, a traditional IT waterfall Prince 2 structured programs. I worked on a pension software platform at one point.
Ooh,
it's really sexy, that is, isn't it? Wow. Yeah. But I mean, the fact is that we had to do that classic waterfall actually made sense in that context. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have understood why games don't work that way as effectively. But I think what's really fascinating to me about that is that if you just go pure agile, you have no delivery dates. And actually, one of the things that I'm very aware of, my weakness is I don't want an end date. I want a KPI delivered target. But sometimes I have to force myself into lighting a fire under people's bellies and making sure it gets done. And sometimes having a high level waterfall is a really good way to make sure, right, this time block we have to do these things. Yes. So I think this is why hybrid approaches are so much more powerful, I think.
I definitely agree. I mean, I think it's kind of right now one of the only ways to effectively get a game done, right? Because you add in the creative element, and a game is never finished. And oftentimes I pitch that to teams and say, one of the wonderful things about working on a LiveOps game is you can live that dream. It doesn't have to be finished. We don't have to cut. We can reprioritize now.
That is literally my favorite thing, because I don't have to kill my darlings. I just postpone them indefinitely.
Yes. And there's, of course, that dance, right, where we're not cutting it. And there's always going to be features that have literally been on your list for 7 years after your game is live. And
I had a home in home. I had on my list that I insisted on keeping there, the idea of having a homing mechanism. So like that back button in a website, I was trying to work out how could you have a equivalent of in-person go back. No one ever signed it off. Never happened.
And but I think there's something psychological about that, of keeping it on the list, and that is helpful to developers, because, as you said, there is this danger of just never shipping in games, because a game is never done. Like, I used to have this conversation with people back in 10, 15 years ago about crunch in games, and people would come from outside the industry and be like, why is it so bad? Why do you have all this crunch? And some of it would be because it's impossible to exhaust the work that could be done on a game. And at some point,
that's the best explanation I think I've ever heard. Yes, actually, that's exactly that.
You could always do more. You could always do more. And I think we've gotten better about this as an industry, but there was a lot of time earlier on where, and I'm sure it's still like this in some places, you would just get to this point with a game where you're like, I could go home right now, but if I put a couple more hours in, if I just come in on this Saturday, if I just work this Sunday, this thing will get so much better. And people are very passionate in games.
Yeah. But I mean, there is that combination of that plus certain management styles, which aren't necessarily most was conducive to
Oh
good
yeah.
working
I
conditions.
mean,
But that's life.
a lot of times what leads to that, right? If you going, ooh, I'm going to come in on that Saturday to make this good, is that the schedule wasn't built so that it could just be made good without you coming in on Saturday, right? Like,
but
which is a
that's
bummer.
where LiveOps, I think, is actually in some ways the saving grace, because you cannot do that. I mean, you just can't. You can't burn a team out because they've got to do next month's content. But the fact that you can then say, hang on a minute, I don't have to build everything. I have to build what I can build in this time frame that then gets tested and then gets released. Now we've got a pipeline of content. That wonderful extra 2 hours coding time is next week, not next weekend.
Yes. And you really try to get teams into that mindset because, as you said, you cannot start crunching in LiveOps.
No, it just, we literally have a
will
ban.
never.
I literally ban. Well,
yes. Yeah, you just have to you have to keep a schedule that's realistic because it doesn't stop. There is no release valve. Like you can't just sprint and then rest. It's really like long distance running. I know it's an overused metaphor, but it's very true. So you really try to get people in that mindset. I often will say things to teams. I try to just get them focused on, try to let go of perfect and just ask, like, the thing that you've done, is it better than it was before? Then you've succeeded. Better is all that matters.
And I want to test it. Just because I think it's better doesn't mean it's better. I mean, actually, to be entirely fair, as most people who know me, I work way too much, more than I should, and I am the worst example. Do not follow me. But what we do insist is, if any of the team decide they're going to work extra hours, and that's fine, they'll have it them to that, but then they have to take it back. They have to claim that time back, because you cannot work consistently, effectively, if you're exhausted, and you're just diminishing return.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things for me that I've seen change over the 20 years is, man, when I was first doing it and we were running these large scale MMOs, we had these server structures that required a lot of hand holding.
Yes.
They required maintenance. If we had a serious bug, we needed to take them down. There were physical machines all over the world and like things that happened to them. That caused a lot of churn when I was early in my career. Like things were just unavoidable. Like, guess what? Like these servers are falling over at 2 a.m. So it's time to get up and deal with it. Especially running games that were really global, where we did not have low concurrency time. We were just sort of spread out. And now that is a DevOps, like the operation of actually running the services, and doing things like uptime and health and monitoring is so much more sophisticated.
So much more.
So much easier in a lot of ways. I mean, on the backs of people who are amazing DevOps professionals, right? Because now we have people who actually devote lots of like time and effort to preparing to make sure that everything runs really smoothly. But that has been a huge improvement, I think.
And you can even outsource it nowadays. I mean, there's teams like Civilian out there who, will just run that for you. So I mean, just they happen to be someone we work with. But I mean, the point I'm trying to get to is, it's not like, I think I made this comment on your podcast, which was, back in the day, the Wireplay service was plugged into like, essentially, I may be misremembering, but I think it's essentially like Earth Station 1, so Jodrell Bank. And we were literally plugged in there, and all of the various other distributed like internet providers, dial-up, this is dial-up era, were all plugged into the same switches. So if one thing went down, everything went down.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think this doesn't happen as much anymore, but there was a time in my career where I would dread getting emails that said something happened to the transatlantic pipe. I don't know if people know this, but there's basically one wire that connects the continents for internet. And you'd be like, we can't, no information's moving back and forth. We're in a lot of trouble. And even like, I remember early in my career working on, this is pretty early. So like, early 2000s, we were running a bunch of servers, internationally, and we were using some hardware that, like a switch, that literally there were only 5 of them in the whole world. And so like we ran into a bug. I remember very clearly it was Christmas Eve, and we ran into a bug on our Switch. Like we were having some unusual traffic
On the
behavior. We ran
actual
into a bug on
hardware.
the Switch. Yes. And we were on the phone. We were like on a call with the manufacturer that made the
Yeah.
Switch, who I won't say because listen, this is
many,
ancient
I know
history.
exactly who
It
you're
was a lot.
talking about.
Yes, we were on a bridge call with them for 8 hours,
Oh my God.
because it was Christmas Eve. We really
Yeah.
needed it to get up and running, and they were like, "We have never seen this. You literally have one of 5 of these pieces of equipment that exist in the world. We're just trying to debug it, like figure out like why, like what is happening. Like we couldn't balance load across any of our servers, and we're like, oh my gosh. And that's not something that really happens anymore.
No, and like I say, I mean, back in the Wireplay days, we were wiring laptop boards up to run Quake servers. There wasn't such a thing as a rack system. Now we just dial up, and there is infinite
and there it is.
data, whether it's Azure or other companies that exist out there. You know, we can just fire up, and virtual servers can run on multiple machines, and it's all configurable remotely with lovely little dashboards telling us what's going on.
It's amazing. But you also just said it, infinite data.
Yeah.
This is another big theme in the podcast, is this this fascinating situation with data where I think we had this dream 20 years ago. It was like, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get all the data we wanted, because we were very constrained on storage space and throughput. And now we can. And then now it's become such a theme that I hear from people like, I'm drowning in data. I don't know what to do with the data. I hear I need to like hire some people to make me some kind of machine learning algorithm in order to do anything. That sounds frightening. Machine learning algorithms take a really long time to develop.
And
what do
vast
I do?
Amounts of data.
So much.
Yeah.
And even if you have that data, how do you process it?
Yeah.
So we are kind of drowning in data at this point. I spent a lot of time with some of my teams talking about like trying to be very disciplined on data and be like, let's only capture, like, what are we going to do with it? Like really have a plan. What are we actually going to do with this information? What are our KPIs? What are we tracking?
Why do we want that information? I mean, we had this big debate I think it was in Home. We were trying to work out how much do we capture? Do we think about the footfall? So do you want to know every footstep that the player takes? Or do you want to poll them every 2 or 3 seconds? Or do you want to just poll them when they change direction by a certain degree? Little things like that make a huge difference in terms of the volume and the usefulness of the data.
And my favorite razor is, can you set a goal for this?
Yeah.
Like what is good? Like, so like if you were going to do the footfalls, I would ask like, what is a good number of footfalls?
Yeah.
And then if you have an answer for that, then I'd be like, what are you going to do if that number is too low?
This is fantastic, because there's a method that was devised by NASA in Pillsbury, used extensively in the food industry. It was basically designed to help the astronauts of the Apollo missions eat, because how do you make sure that the food isn't going to spoil? So this is called HACCP, so Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, which is basically what you just described. We work out what does the thing that's going to stop us or enable us to do the thing we want to do, where in the process can we actually make a difference? And if you don't track the things that actually make a difference and what good looks like, you cannot increasingly and consistently improve your process. But the other trick that the HACCP thing does, which I love, is that you have to review the process itself. So it's not just good enough to have a process where you go, these are the things that could go wrong, and these are what good looks like. I have to actually review the whole thing on a regular basis. And I think that to me is a metaphor for how we make sure that we know what data we want, but also how we run good live ops in general.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that's been interesting to me over the course of a lot of my career is how much there is to learn outside of games. Game development can be really insular. And I understand it, like having been a designer, it's sometimes very challenging actually to connect what we do out to much of anything else. But you're talking about like, like manufacturing and like safety regulations, which there's some really fascinating stuff that is in like sort of industrial design and like the way that manufacturing is designed that you might find quite useful. You should know that like that's where waterfall came from.
Yeah, of course.
Right, originally was manufacturing. The other one is merchandising and pricing theory. There's actually quite a lot of literature on merchandising and pricing theory, and it'll take a little bit of work to translate it, but it's not invalid. Like there's really interesting stuff.
Completely agree, and I'm still obsessed with Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, which wasn't intended for games at all, but I think it's an absolutely perfect kind of metaphor for technology adoption, therefore for games.
Yeah, but absolutely.
Almost all of the stuff that I learned in terms of running, even back in the 3 days when we were running an app store, we were doing variable pricing. We were doing time state price reductions. We were doing offers all based on retail principles, not based on game design principles.
Right. And that stuff is useful. The other areas too, like I'll say, I'm kind of obsessed with Robin Dunbar and like the research into the way humans form relationships with each other and so what community lives. I'm kind of obsessed with that. Which kind of makes sense if you're making really large scale games. You should think about it. If you're doing social design, especially, like you should think about the way humans naturally cluster ourselves. And then the other one for me is I had someone recently asked me like to recommend a game design book like that was not introductory, like that was more advanced. And I thought about it for a long time and ultimately decided to suggest Christopher Alexander's Timeless Way of Building, which is a book about architectural theory. But it's if you haven't read it, it's fascinating.
That sounds great.
More famous for a pattern language. Also, if you're interested in UX, the pattern language work is really great. But a Timeless Way of Building is.
I think I have it because I think it sounds like the one that was recommended because of the UX.
Yes.
But I've actually not read
a pattern language.
My Kindle list.
Yeah, no, a pattern language is probably like more famous work and super useful. But if you are making virtual worlds, if you are trying to make space in which humans should interact with each other, if you are going to design a social hub of any kind in a game, I highly recommend reading A Timeless Way of Building.
Oh, to be honest, I wish I'd had read that when we were working in PlayStation. The thing that we found is the use of architectural design in that virtual space, how that affected people's behavior and flow, particularly natural experience, where if you wanted to go and find the action thing and you had a building in the distance that looked like some kind of army base with smoke coming out of it, people naturally went over there. Whereas if you had a building over the other way, which looks a bit more like a Disney kind of like fun, friendly inflatables thing, people who went over there, they didn't have to tell them that was the action section. You didn't have to tell them that was the family friendly stuff. They just knew. And it's same thing with retail, thinking about the flow of in character. Yes, of course you can always go fast to it with the menu, but that wasn't the point. It was you want to feel part of the virtual world, and how do you flow through it? I love all that kind of stuff.
And that, I mean, I think that stuff is so important to think about, as you said, like, and why looking at things like retail merchandising can sort of give you a different perspective that's helpful, because it's very easy to get over-indexed on when we look at like store design, like in-game store design. It's very easy to over-index on like, yes, there is a percentage of people who know exactly what they want. But the truth is actually they know exactly what they want. And actually their path to what they want is very simple.
Yes.
Most people are going to arrive and not know exactly what they want. And you do have to actually accommodate them, or you should accommodate them if you want to sort of have any chance of getting them to find what they they don't know they want, but they do want.
Yeah, again, this is very super familiar because we were doing back in the old Wireplay days. We couldn't do this nowadays because it wouldn't scale, but we used to have club captains who ran teams. We actually had them reporting into a liaison, all this other stuff. But what we found is we needed a game pro. What a game pro was at the time was somebody who would jump between the silos of the games, who could say, oh, you like this kind of game. Did you know this game exists?
Yeah.
That ability to kind of matrix things in terms of the community, the consumer community experience is super important because it's so easy for people to get stuck in silos. I do want to come back though to your obsession with Dunbar. Golf Clash for me,
Mm-hmm.
the perfect matchmaking approach that really understands the Dunbar principles is
Mm-hmm.
what the guys did at the team behind Golf Clash, and Paul and
Mm-hmm.
the team there were very nice to me and my boss at Unity at the time. We were doing some interesting stuff around social. Never came to
Mm-hmm.
anything, but it was an interesting discussion. They talked us through how their tournament system worked, where it caps out. So you'll basically spawn a new tournament when you get more than 100 people.
Right.
So 100 people
Yeah.
repeated, as scaled as much as possible. But then the top 10% of top 10 of those each 3 or
Mm-hmm.
5 days would get promoted to the next tournament of
Right.
100
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And why that's so clever is because 100 people feels meaningful because of the Dunbar
Mm-hmm.
number. And if you continue to rise to your level of skill, you're rising
Mm-hmm.
with other people who you have
Yes.
previously played with, building that
Yeah.
reinforced familiarity. And
Yeah,
to
those
me,
ladder
amazing.
systems are really smart. And the thing that we also I think a lot about Dunbar's number around also is when we think about how to create communities that are going to have a better level, like a low level of toxicity, or we can actually effectively manage
Yep.
or tend so that they're hopefully the best version of the community that they can be. That number is so helpful because I just think as developers, we get obsessed with big numbers. We're like, what if there was 10,000 people in a map together? And that's at some point not that meaningful because humans can't really think about that many people. But it also is helpful to think about the way we communicate with others. And a lot of Dunbar's work is like how friendship formation happens, and like what close bonds look like. And when you start understanding that our brains can only hold the idea of so many people,
Yeah.
and so when you're confronted with large groups, we fall way back on heuristics. We fall way back on stereotypes. We don't see people as individuals anymore. We sort of see them as like whatever group we identify them with. And so keeping groups smaller you're just increasing your chance of more positive social interaction. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it to a large extent. I think Dunbar just last year published a pretty approachable book.
Mm.
So I highly recommend checking it out. I think it's just called Friends.
Okay.
But maybe streaming it. But it's sort of just a sort of layperson's summary of a lot of his work. If you're interested in social design, definitely check it out.
It sounds fantastic. I will be checking that out myself, and I'm assuming it doesn't have Rachel in it.
No, I don't think so.
Sorry. Old pop culture references. What can I say?
Yes.
Anyway, so I think this whole principle. I think what we're trying to say, I think, is that LiveOps isn't actually this cold, heartless, evil corporation thing that we often get labeled at. What I think you've been talking about consistently is providing services that players care about, that they can communicate. And I love the word you used there, that tending the community rather than managing the community. I think that's a really good kind of way to think about it, because what I think emotionally we're trying to talk about is we're trying to create a framework that players can then own themselves. Is that
right?
Fair summary?
Absolutely. And that the tending thing comes from Raf Koster. Like he's very big into do not managing your community. They're not your employees. They're not, unruly children. You're trying to tend that community so that it is healthy.
Yeah.
And thrives and becomes self-sustaining, right? That's sort of the ideal. And I think I hate the term games as a service. It's like one of my least favorite terms. My team hears this from me a lot. I'm sorry. I don't love it. And it's the same thing. Like the game itself is not a service, not a utility. It's not something that players are like, I just want you to give this to me, and get out of my way. I really love the term games as community because that is really what you're trying to build. It's persistent because it has history and because it has people interacting with it over time.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the reason why I like games as those is because I have a classical marketing background. So for me, it's a distinction from product.
Yes. Yeah. It's very
Yeah,
practical.
it's it's a very practical way of looking at it, like you say. And like I say, in fact, my aim there actually, I mean, again, I'm biased after all, given I did, literally write the book
I know,
called
yes.
that. So it's fine. I totally get it. And actually, I think we're moving increasingly into living games in general.
Yes, yeah.
Which we have to say, Phil at Jagex is the one who we heard coin that phrase. So I always have to.
That's a good
Phil's
one.
fantastic guy, and I always want to make sure I credit him whenever I use that phrase, because I think it's important that we kind of like recognize that there are lots of people out there in this community who make games who are really trying to contribute to the language. And I think living games is a really nice way. The trouble is, when I talk about live games, when I talk about games as a service, when I talk about living games, I have the same problem, which is when you talk to a developer who doesn't understand it, we literally ask them this question: what makes your game as a service? And I had literally the answer: because it's fun.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay.
An interesting answer.
So you're going to come to you're coming to a living game publisher, and you're going to tell me that your game is live opsable because it's
fun. I mean, there's something deep in there maybe about like the nature of fun, but it's a lot to dig through to get to your real answer.
And by the way, it was not a live opsable experience.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons I index so hard on games as community is it does take explanation, but I spend so much of my time talking to devs, and I want them to understand that one of the biggest shifts they're making if they want to make a live opsable game, if they want it to be successful, is they got to move away from making a game for them and making a game for the community. And understand it is their game, and that you are sort of creating an opportunity and a space for them to have the fun they want to have. And I said, there's nothing wrong with making a game for you. I like linear games. I play a lot of linear games. They're really fun. A lot of times I come to them because I want to see the developer's point of view. I want that. I don't want, a sort of middle of the road experience. I want something that they really are bringing their unique point of view to. But when I come to a live ops game, I want something where I can be more in the driver's seat, where like I'm having a lot more of an influence over my own experience. And when players invest time into your game over months and years, they feel some ownership. And I know that sometimes that causes tension, and there's another line of thinking we could dig into that. But regardless of how you feel about it, they do feel ownership. And it's important, I think, for developers to understand that like what you are making is a community. Like that is what you are ultimately delivering. And you've got to focus on making that work, which also means caring about the way the community forms, who's in the community, what your social norms are going to be inside the community. Even if you're, making a game where, like, I'll use a great example because it's so popular, like Fortnite. Like you would say, like, is it really a community? It is a community. Absolutely. Even though like most of the activity is this very like structured, session round based competition, it still ultimately, thrives because it is a community and because it is a place where, something that is a cultural touchstone for people.
And I think that's the crux of it. This is why when I'm trying to help people think about the design of these things, I try and get them thinking layers. So I think about the mechanic, the things that you do, the context, the sense of purpose and progression that delivers that. That's what I mean by the context. Now, a lot of people call that meta, but I think that's a mistake. I think for me, meta is the stuff that isn't the game. It's stuff like that lifestyle fit. How is this game being played? How does the device being used affect that play? I think it's also the social and collaboration competition type stuff. But I think it's also this zeitgeist thing. It's that ability for somebody to watch you play or to see the output of your play and be interested in it. I think getting that last bit of that metagame, that zeitgeist bit, is what Fortnite has done amazingly.
It is a cultural touchstone.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. And I like your attempt to sort of separate those, though. And I do like the term context because, often in MMOs, we talk a lot about there are always two games being played, the game being played by your character and the game being played by you, the player.
Absolutely.
And they have to live together. But it's also sometimes very useful to know when you're designing something like, what's happening right now for the character and what's happening right now for the player. Because it could be if you're going to compete or you're going to like complete like a high level dungeon, what's happening for your character is you're going to gain great gear, right? You're going to get some great loot. What's happening for you as the player is you're bonding with your raid group, you're achieving something together, you're gaining a story to tell, or you're gaining some social capital. And so you kind of have to be able to talk about both of those things.
Yeah.
And I have found it's sometimes harder for people who have made really immersive experiences that are amazing, where your goal is like get rid of the player, right? Like it's just the character, and help the player like disappear into the character. But for most, I think live ops games, you really have to be thinking about both at the same time.
Definitely, no, absolutely, no question about it. And I think it's a challenge to. We're going back to this: is live ops complicated or not? And the answer is yes and no.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's in some ways it's a bit like your comment about in games. There's always more you can do. Of course there is. And I think it's finding those challenges that we can fight, and it's finding the shortcuts, which allows us to hit, the current problem, so that we then have a process that means that we can then move on to the next problem and the next problem. And I think that's one of that sort of joys. That's where the economy of scale comes in living service games, because if you're genuinely, authentically connecting with players as a community, you're building something that they're taking forward, where they are the content, rather than relying on you every 3 months having a new function, which actually is possibly even a waste of time, because you're taking people further away from the core of what engagement in the first place. I mean, don't get me wrong, you should always update features, but it's understanding what is it that they care about that's more important. And I think that's why monetization is such a big part of why we're currently getting a bit of backlash in some games that have become services, because the monetization hasn't been done necessarily with the joy of the player in mind, with the player value in mind. That's one thing again I always kind of focus on, which is like, I'm sure you'll agree, we have to understand why the players want it in the first place, and that they're going to desire it. If you don't desire the things that we're selling, we haven't offered the right stuff. And free to play is a magnificent playground to make better games, I think, but only if we're honest to the players about the value we're trying to offer them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when I talk about ethical monetization, I try to dive really deeply into like understanding that ethics is about operating in a pro-social way, right? Like these are the rules that might sort of help us exist in society. Like we all agree we're being fair, like we all agree we're being equitable. And to really try to focus on that, right? This is about win-win. What can we do where the players are getting just as much as we're getting? Like everything should balance. We should strive for that balance, because we want to be a part of their society, right? When we act exploitatively, we're being antisocial, right? We're creating a big barrier between us and them. Usually that means, and you can look at that. I mean, I could get like very dramatic about like examples of this and say like, I mean, it's just like running, if you are a con person, right? Like you're an antisocial person. Like you go in, you try to sort of fake being a social person for a while, get the money, and then you run away, right? We obviously, that's quite dramatic, but like, and plenty of developers, it has happened for sure. I would say the vast majority of developers are not going like, how can I be totally antisocial? I have an evil.
Vast majority of developers are the opposite. They may be antisocial, but that's because they just want to sit and make great games.
Yes, exactly. So it really is about trying to figure out, how do we exist together in sort of in a harmony. I love live ops games because I do think they sort of force us to think long term. You can't really be very successful with a live ops game that doesn't last. It's probably not going to work for you. You can certainly roll the dice on that, but that's a huge gamble. The better way to build is to say, I want to have a relationship with my players for a long time. And that really like puts this emphasis on you. And I agree about free to play. I think it can be very good for developers to get closer to that question. I know a lot of them are uncomfortable with it, but that's a bit of a privileged position to say, well, I don't want to have to be there or get involved when my players give us money. I just want that to be handled somewhere else. I think it's very good for you to like be a little closer to that and be a little bit more accountable for the way you ask players for money and like what you offer them. Because I think it builds a stronger understanding on your part, more empathy from you about what you are building.
And I think to do that successfully, you, like you say, you have to have empathy, but you have to really care about the player's perception of value. And I think, how can you understand the direction of the game as a whole needs to go if you're not actually offering them something which consistently engages? I mean, I often end my slides with, you know, live ops is all about love. It's love ops, not game, not live ops, because we want games that players love, and we want to love our players. Otherwise, we can't deliver the things that the players love.
Yes.
So for me, that's what it's all about.
So important.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's so important too. Like it's hard though. I think when you look at human psychology, you do understand how difficult it is to trust, because it's about trust.
Yes, it is.
It's about the trust that we sometimes have a hard time trusting our players, and I get it. Sometimes it feels very tough to trust them, that if we do the right thing and we love them and we give them things, that they'll return that. That's very challenging. And I think the way that feedback comes in can make it even more challenging. And you really have to work with your team on how your feedback pipeline is going to work, because it's very easy to have negative voices overwhelm you. And to hear things, you know, to hear this message coming from your community that they don't love you back. And even if it's really not true, because, you know, people are individuals, they're not just sort of an average of everything that's happening, but it really does come down to that trust. And it can be quite a leap of faith for developers to say, you know what, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to trust that they'll love it. And when they love it, they'll want to support us.
And like you say, it's listening to the underlying momentum, not necessarily the highly vocal, more difficult people I mean, like I say, let's not, you know, paint it prettily. You know, there were death threats at PlayStation, you know, for PlayStation Home. I mean, they were not enacted, thank goodness. You know, there wasn't no one ever turned up, but when you get that kind of violent language, it's horrendous. However,
it is really hard. I mean, I will say, because like I've had them myself, and even though, you know, when you get them, that this is not, even if it's really not credible, there's nothing like super personally identifiable in it, and you're like, yes, almost certainly nothing is going to happen here. It's just disturbing. It is hard to just ignore it.
Oh, absolutely. But the bottom line is that when you see, you know, the like, for example, the end of PlayStation Home, when they shut it down on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, 2015, there were people, hundreds, if not thousands of people, sitting there waiting for it to close down. They were sitting, I have a photo of a bunch of guys who were sat on a beach scene around a campfire just talking until they switched it off. And that, to me, is a kind of beautiful thing, that this community, who were not understood by Sony, wanted so much to still be there at the end.
I mean, it's one of those things that you got to always remind yourself, like, you're making something that's so important to people. It becomes part of their identity. It becomes a place where they met friends. It becomes a place where they made memories and shared histories together. It really is important to them. And sometimes that passion bubbles over into, you know, sometimes like a really, like, you know, over the top reactions. Not talking about death threats. I think that's a different thing, but just people being like, you're ruining my game, or like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so worried. It's understandable where that comes from, actually.
And you kind of need a filter to it. But then, let's face it, we know that people have got married through games. We know people have got divorced through games. You know, all of human life has happened in games in some way. And I think one of my favorite live ops moments, which is a really sad one, and I don't want to kind of diminish it, but back in the early days of Wireplay, there was one of the leading players of a game called Air Attack who died in a car crash. And it was one of those moments where on a dial-up modem, bear in mind, a game that was designed for 60 simultaneous people maximum. We had 150 people at one point doing a fly past of a scene where they just changed the scene for Gravestone. And as I mean, nothing nowadays, but the fact was that was the first time in, as far as I'm aware, in internet history, where that got covered in national press. That a living community mourned one of its members publicly with sufficient impetus that it got covered in the national press. And that to me is just the heart of things.
There are true virtual communities. I think probably the closest we've got in the internet age to real communities. I think that's a lovely sentiment, maybe to wrap it up on.
I think so. I think we're there. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much for that. It's been fantastic chatting to you. Obviously, I recommend that people check out your podcast. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the podcast?
Yeah, it's called The Art of LiveOps. LiveOps is one word. You can sort of find it anywhere. It's we've got 3 seasons up, and it's basically just an ongoing conversation. Every episode, we interview a different person working in LiveOps, and we've covered a wide range of people: designers, producers, technologists, marketers, community people. We try to get as broad of a spectrum as possible. We just want to hear people's firsthand experience and personal stories making LiveOps games.
And they've even had a strange hat-wearing person on as well.
Yes.
So, thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. I have been your Game Dev London podcast host. I have been delighted to be joined with Crystin and talk about games as community. And I hope you've enjoyed that. Obviously, if you've enjoyed this podcast, if you enjoy this, then do the usual, the like, subscribe, etc. And as we said, just please feel free to check out the Art of LiveOps podcast, which is genuinely brilliant. I listen to it myself, not just because I'm here talking to Crystin. And frankly, I hope you can take lessons from this and go out and make amazing and beautiful, wonderful game experiences that your community will love. Thank you for listening to the Game Dev London podcast.